I am Pascal Dauptin, Global Ad Product Director at the New York Times Company, and I would like to welcome you to the New York Times Climate Hub. During the next few days, the New York Times Climate Hub will be home to business decision makers, policymakers, innovators, scientists, and the local community here in Glasgow, who together will discuss, debate, and find actionable climate solutions. Before the session kicks in, led by my colleague Hannah Fairfield, I would like to thank our sponsor, Morgan Stanley, for sponsoring this session. I would like to thank you for joining us here in Glasgow, as well as virtually all around the world. And for virtual audiences, please remember you can submit your questions via the broadcast.
I'm Audrey Choi, Chief Sustainability Officer at Morgan Stanley and CEO of the Institute for Sustainable Investing. Welcome to the New York Times Climate Hub, taking place alongside COP26. The health of our planet is now the existential issue for business leaders and government leaders alike. The important conversations happening here in Glasgow are a critical catalyst for the actions we need to take to stem the long-term effects of climate change. Clearly, the time for action is now. To begin, I'd like to share with you some of our best thinking on one of the topics we're here to discuss. Thank you, and enjoy the session.
60% of carbon emissions comes from energy, and this is a key area where we can focus on reducing emissions by using technology. I'm Jessica Alsford, Head of Global Sustainability Research at Morgan Stanley. The 5 key technologies that are needed to decarbonise energy are renewables, electric vehicles, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen, and biofuels. Many of these decarbonisation technologies are commercially viable today. Renewables are really exciting because actually you've seen a huge decrease in the cost over the last decade or so. And so now in many regions, they're actually much cheaper than the fossil fuel equivalent. We see attractive investment opportunities across many of these 5 technologies. Some are earlier short-term opportunities, some are longer term, but all have a real role to play in investment decisions. I'm Jessica Alsford, and we are Morgan Stanley.
John, you're so far away.
I think we'll have to leave an empty chair. This is great. Thank you. I'm Hannah Fairfield. I'm the climate editor of the New York Times, and I am thrilled to be here with you all, talking about how and what to prioritize for the transition to net zero, and how we are defining both success and the pathway to get there. So I'd like to introduce the panelists right now, starting with Ani Dasgupta, the president and CEO of the World Resources Institute, and then Tahseen Jaffrey, the director of the Center for Climate Justice, Glasgow Caledonian University, John Doerr, chair of Kleiner Perkins, Catherine Hayhoe, climate scientist and chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. And then on screen joining us, we have Francesco Storese, the CEO of NL. Welcome, everybody. I am so glad that we are here today. Let's open by talking about where we are starting from, because we are not starting from scratch. And I'm excited really to hear from everyone today. It's a big panel, we've got a lot of time. But my first question is for Catherine, whose book titled Saving Us is full of optimism and hope. Catherine, what do you see in the transition to net zero that gives you optimism? And how do we build on the momentum?
Well, first of all, I named the book Saving Us because the planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It is not the planet that's at stake, it is us and many other living things that share it with us. I called it Hope and Healing, though, because when we look around us, we realize that the giant boulder of climate action is not sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on it, and if we add our hand, it won't even budge a millimeter. No, when we look around, we see that that giant boulder is already at the top of the cliff. It is already rolling down the hill in the right direction on the other side, and there are millions of hands on it already. We just need more.
So my next question is for Ani. Tell me what is different today here in Glasgow at COP26 versus Paris. What has changed?
I think it's actually quite different. It's not only just COP, what has happened to the world in this time. You can't avoid reading the newspaper this year, a whole year actually, without nature, where climate things are happening because of climate change, like natural things are happening all over the world, right? Last 2 years, we've had the most disastrous pandemic we are middle of, and the countries, because of that, there's economic recovery every country is thinking about. So the context where we are is very different. At the same time, there is optimism, I completely share with you, because even our own math shows, even 2 years back, we were heading to a 2.7, maybe 2.8 degrees. Even now, with what the commitments people have made that you were hearing, hopefully it'll be more positive, we would be at 2.4 or better. Our calculation shows all the commitments people have made, that is not part of the NDCs, but all the commitments in net zero, and we could be at 2.1 degrees world. So things are moving in the direction, not enough, I just want to underline, not enough. And the last thing I want to say, in the middle of this world where, during the vaccine distribution, I must say, world as a community didn't do that well. There's a lot of questioning of multilateralism. But this particular corner of multilateralism, where countries in Paris, as you said, came together and said, tell us what you're going to do as a country X, and 5 years later, come back and ratchet up your ambition. Most of the countries actually have done that, not all of them, most of them. So that's that process of coming together, egging each other up, increasing ambition, that is happening. So that is very positive. It's not happening fast enough. Hopefully we'll go there. But there is some optimism to be seen in the process that was set up in Paris.
So something else that also is changing is market forces. Francesco, could you speak to how market forces have been changing, particularly in the private sector?
Well, definitely, I subscribe to what Ali said. Perhaps not only the context has changed, but perhaps even more our perception of the context itself. I mean, how do we understand what's going on, I think? And the markets typically are a very plastic expression of how this perception has changed. We see demand of renewable energy, we see demand of sustainable finance, we see an increasing appetite for this kind of circular economy concepts that 5 years ago existed. They were not simply invented in these 5 years, but were not absolutely met by a demand that is so strong. So I think the market has brought this perception into action in terms of demand. And so today we see a big shift from a push. You remember 5 years, 10 years ago, renewables were pushed by incentivization and subsidies. Now there is a pool of customers and demand that asks for it because it is economically interesting and it is reducing the risk that we're all facing in terms of climate change and also in terms of exposure to volatility. And the financial markets are getting there in a big way. I think the success of Sustainable Development Goal-linked finance is a testimony of that. This is now a strong tool in the hands of financial investors, and that they're making a good use of it. So perception has changed, and the market definitely took good note of that.
John, how do you see growth in renewables and electrification? How do you see change from where we are now? How do you see the speed and scale changing in the next decade? I quote a book, I believe, that is coming out next week.
Oh.
Yes, you do. Speed and scale. And it's a website also which lays out a plan. And the plan's available for free to anyone to download and inspect. And you asked, well, where are we with, let me step back from renewables to the big picture. I think what we've got to do for humanity on the planet is focus on the gigatons, the largest emitting nations and the largest emitting sectors of the economy. Because we're in a rate race. We have a decade, the science tells us, to reduce emissions by 50%. And if you take all of the current pledges and assume that we execute on those with policy, they don't get us far enough. Some estimates, as you know, they'll lead to only a 7% reduction in emissions. So we're headed in the right direction, but we've got to do more and go faster. I'd say my view is, I may not be optimistic, but I'm hopeful. I can see how we get there.
Tahseen, also since Paris, there has been a lot of momentum about issues of fairness and equity, especially when it comes to financing. So how can those be best addressed as we accelerate this transition to net zero?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I want to just quickly wrap it up with the question that was posed earlier on about what's different since Paris and the implications for climate finance. What's actually happened is the world has changed considerably due to COVID. We're seeing much more inequality across the world, across the poorest nation states. The impact of COVID has directed finance away from NDC targets. Many countries are really struggling to meet those targets. The financing has been directed away from tackling climate change towards tackling COVID. And I think, this whole business of climate inequality is so significant now that we mustn't underestimate and undervalue the impact that has across the poorest nation states. So with reference to climate finance, it's even more important now than it's ever been before that financing structures are set in place to support the poorest nations, the poorest people in those nations, particularly the vulnerable women and girls. So we're talking about not just the quantity of finance, that's the pledges that we've not met, but also thinking about how to get finance to those who need it the most. So it's access, we're talking about availability of, we're talking awareness of and affordability of financing structures and mechanisms that can help the poorest countries.
Can I just add
please.
2 sentences to this? I actually don't think that enough has happened in financing in the just way or to the poorest way. I mean, there are 3 things. I mean, the transition John just talked about, it's not just a transition of decarbonization, it's a whole system transition that we have to make sure that it is just for the people who are getting most affected by climate change right now, just for people who might lose jobs or change jobs, need to get trained. And just the simple indicators, even the $100 billion that you've been hearing about, it was, I think by now it might be $100 billion. It was pretty difficult to get there. And we've been working with poor and vulnerable countries last year called Act 25. They could not believe why was it so difficult when countries, same countries, rich countries, put together $15 trillion to recover from COVID. So, it doesn't add up in their perspective. And There was promise of 50% finance for adaptation. That still hasn't happened. Loss and damage is on the table this year. So I'm glad you asked the question. I actually don't think enough has happened to make this just and fair. But I'm hopeful, I'm not optimistic, but hopeful like John, that because people are asking these questions.
Well, I'd actually like to continue that, talking about how can we ensure that solutions are available to all so that the gap between development narrows instead of widens. How do we make that happen?
So I think the best single thing we can do is lower the cost premium for green and clean technologies. The United States ought to go first. We're the largest historic emitter. We must prove that you can decarbonize an economy and do that so that we lower the costs for all the rest of the world. The financing mechanisms, there's plenty of money, but the institutions are not responding. By that I mean the World Bank and the IMF have 80-year-old charters that haven't changed in 80 years, and they need to be empowered and funded to provide the first loss capital, which will then unlock trillions of dollars of other funding from pensions and other shareholders, asset owners who want to finance the green economy. We have plenty of capital in the world. It's estimated it'll cost $4 trillion a year to retool the economy over 20 years or so. But the costs of the climate crisis are 2.5 times that. It's $10 trillion a year. So you literally can, it's cheaper to save the planet than it is to ruin it on the course we're on now.
Catherine, I see you nodding.
Absolutely. I was just asked by a student the other day, is it possible that we might spend too much money to fix climate change to the point where it would damage the economy? And I said, the economy cannot float around in outer space without the resources this planet provides. The question is not what is too much. The question is it enough? Because if we don't fix climate change, there will be no economy.
But, sorry.
Please.
So one thing I want to add to John, both of you, is there is one big shift that has happened, which is good, since Paris to now, which is the following. When we were in Paris, there were still big countries, I won't name them, that were still arguing that development and climate change are two different things, and we are poorer countries, leave us alone, you created the problem, you go fix it, and actually what is great about this now is not a single country saying that. That the debate between whether we can grow or have a successful economy and can it be green, I think people have accepted that is possible. It's not demonstrated yet, John, but people have accepted the framework or mindset shift, which is, I think, a very big question. So there's not a single economy country now, and you remember, you and I live in a country that denied there was climate change for a while. There's not a single, actually poorer countries have more ambitious climate plans right now because they see the effect of climate change. So this is a good movement. We just have to ride it and make it actually, as you said, see the outcomes possible so people can see it.
Maybe there is something here that I can add to what Annie has said. I think it is absolutely the case that what before was considered a trade-off between decarbonization or climate concern and economy is not anymore there on a larger scale. I mean, not everyone is fully on board on that, but by and large, the consensus is getting there, which makes the case easier for this industrial economic transition to happen. It's just the energy transition that enables this. This is just the beginning of the process. It's, if you want, the starting engine of a big change, because it's not only the economy that needs to be decarbonized, it's the whole economy. It's not only the energy sector, it's the whole economy. But the starting difference from this, between this transformation and the others that took place before, we had a lot of industrial transformations and technology-driven transformations in the past. They all inevitably brought about some kind of inequality within themselves. Those that benefited from that and those that were left aside or even damaged by the transition itself. Although it was perhaps, if you want, the digital transition is an example of it. If you want, there are many of these kind of things. In this case, not only we are conscious of the fact that there is a synergic effect between the decarbonization of our economy and the economy itself, but we are also concerned about the fact that this transition cannot happen with increasing inequalities around the world. So this is quite a unique feature this time. I think it's the only time that I can recall in history where people really have a chance to understand the dynamic before they happen. So I think it's a unique moment, and climate is a big tool for that. Climate is, if you want, a unifying force that will drive this message in a very powerful way if it is understood not just as a crisis, but as an opportunity to really move the planet forward.
If I could I comment?
Please.
Yeah, if I could just pick up from those remarks there. I think when we're talking about the whole just transition process, I think it's important that we move the debates and conversations that go beyond just decarbonising the energy sector. This is about a whole of society approach. It involves everybody, and that's where this issue of justice really comes in, because not everyone has that ability to adapt to and change behaviours so that we can, as much as they would like to, but because of lack of, because of affordability, perhaps even about awareness and education. And so there's a lot of work that needs to go on to get everyone on that journey and ensure that no one is left behind in this process. And that's where the real challenge is, making sure that everyone is part and parcel of the solutions, because you mentioned solutions. Solutions need to be driven from bottom up. It can't just be driven from policymakers.
I wanted specifically to ask you about the equitability of health outcomes associated with climate. I think that is incredibly important, and I'd like to just take a moment to talk about how important that is as we move toward solutions.
I mean, in terms of, in terms of health outcomes, the benefits of a healthier environment will benefit everyone in society. It's about improving health and well-being for all. Clean air will improve, the quality of our air will help those who are asthmatic, for example. And we were, in the UK, we had the first death of a 9-year-old in London who lived in a polluted corridor. And she came from the BAME community. It was the first recorded death due to asthma, an asthma attack because of polluting vehicles, right? And that strikes, that whole example was so powerful, it struck a chord with many people, because it's not just about health and well-being per se in terms of a strategic approach, but it's ensuring that the health and well-being of those who are particularly sort of left behind and minority groups. We need to make sure that those strategies benefit those who are on the front line of those climate. Being in those climate corridors is really, really important that we tackle and address those issues. We hear that in New York as well. There's the poorest communities are living in the most polluted neighborhoods. So we need to be very clear as to our strategic vision and our approach, that what we want to do benefits and improves the health and well-being for all, but being really truly committed to that cause and not just words.
This is a total system transformation. The thing that's most similar to it in our lifetimes is how the free world, or the Western world, mobilized to deal with the Axis threat of Nazis in World War II. The Western world stopped making automobiles, stopped making appliances, and devoted those factories to making aircraft, 286,000 aircraft in 4 years, battleships, and other tools so that democracy could survive. I want to compare that with what's on the agenda and possible in this clean energy revolution, because I think there's 3 really powerful equities we should strive for we should measure and commit to. The first of those is health equity. And we ought to say that pollution-related mortality rates, disparities in those disappear by economic differences, by racial differences.
Yeah.
And we do that around the world. We should eliminate education equities. The world can afford to have universal education for boys, but especially for girls, by 2040. And finally, there's economic equity, so that the new jobs that are created, some 25 million in the next 8 years, are not inequitably distributed around the world. And this is not going to be some kind of green party. It's not kumbaya. This is total system transformation. So what I mean by that is there are going to be winners, there are going to be losers. The nations that commit early and grow the green economy, as China has with solar, are going to own those industries and will be the low-cost producer. The best thing that we can do is prioritize this transition, liberate the capital, invest, and assure that this transition is viewed and realized as the greatest opportunity for humankind.
I can agree with you, John, that this is the greatest opportunity. I also want to underline that this transition is complicated and different in every country. Every country has a different starting point and different set of institutions. So to get to the equitable outcome, we need to be not only very intentional, but we need to be very country specific. So United States you talked about. Only thing I want to add to that is getting the transition right, rather than talking about decarbonization, which is what John just talked about as a whole economy approach, and understanding and helping. It's not decarbonizing energy, as you just heard. It's about the buildings, about automobiles, getting agriculture right. And we're talking about a set of governments which are financially constrained and capacity constrained. So how do you help to make this multivariable decisions? What do you do first? What do you do faster? And I think all of us, at least at WRI, we are very committed to this, is to actually be partner in this transition, because getting that right, I think it's not just needed, it is politically important. If we don't have countries that are successfully transitions and have good outcomes, good air quality for our communities, good air, water, walkable streets, then they won't elect people who need to have more ambitious climate policy. That cycle of changes without demonstrated outcomes, that is why we all need to focus on transition, John, but also it's not a global thing. We can't sit here and agree on a transition strategy. We have to have country specificity, and we have to help, I think, all of us in country-specific outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And every country does have its own story. I'd like to look at a specific today, the news out today about 23 different countries that are moving away from coal. Poland, Vietnam, Chile. You know, gas has been a transition fuel for many countries, including the United States, lowering the carbon footprint. But today's news about many countries moving away from coal, what does that actually mean for these countries to shift? Are they going to move to a transition fuel, or are they going to move straight to renewables? How is that going to look?
John?
It depends on their plan. As you point out, every country is different. The IEA is really very clear. We've got to stop coal. And the faster we can stop coal, the better we'll be able to realize our equity agenda. Because the best thing we can do for humankind is to stop pouring 59 gigatons of emissions into the atmosphere as if it's some kind of free and open sewer. That's our number one obligation. That means go for the gigatons, the biggest emitters, and have national specific enacted policies. I love pledges, I love goals, but the way to get this done is with enacted policy and plans.
If I can interject here, I think these countries, they have their differences in terms of natural endowment and what they can or cannot do. But one of them, Chile, for example, we are very active there. They are basically switching to renewables altogether. They are a country that has been blessed by all kinds of renewable potential, so they will not switch to gas. They will go directly into renewables. And by the way, they have no gas. They have to import gas too from Argentina, from LNG sources around the world. So it depends very much on the country, let's say, nature itself. But all in all, I think switching out of coal as a fallback, having gas as a transient, requires a very careful planning. I totally agree with John. Countries need to be very clear about the end of the goal that they want to achieve, because locking yourself into gas for another 20, 30 years is not a solution going forward. It's just a prolonged agony for these systems. So I think planning is super important, considering a peculiarity of this transition that is quite new to planners. This is a front-loaded transition. I mean, this is a front-loaded investment curve which brings benefit over the years. So it's very different than the energy systems we had in the past. And that requires a big mindset change by planners, fiscal and financial authorities, because you need to bet a lot of money now in order to have benefits over the long term, not just diluting this effort over the years. And I like the parallel that John has made with the Second World War. This is a little bit like that. You know, the Second World War was a huge financial effort, funded by bonds that the countries that won the war finally subscribed. The people of these countries did that. And I think it's something that needs to happen again.
I just want to add that it is a huge deal that the 23 countries have said no coal. Anyone like John, you would ask, what is one thing you would wish that will happen? Is countries get out of coal.
Stop coal.
Yeah. So this 23 countries signing up for that, pledging that, includes countries. It is difficult to do that, and Indonesia is in there, Vietnam is in there. I think that's a very big deal. The second thing is, what do they do to replace it, right? The economics actually is on our side. In most countries except two, renewable is cheaper to put together from scratch than gas. So that's a good thing. But it's as you heard, it's a front-loaded transition. In the last few days, there's significant capital available for the transition, I think, including philanthropic capital that was announced recently for energy. So it is looking like a better picture than we imagined a year back. I just want to say this transition, and hopefully many more countries will add to the 23 countries. I think it's a very significant pledge. It's not easy, I just want to point out, because many people work in the sector across the world.
What about countries that have gas as a resource?
There's a lot of countries that have petroleum as a resource, gas as a resource.
Will they use it as a transition fuel? They move off of coal, move onto gas, invest in the infrastructure? What is that going to look like for the next few decades?
You know, if the same question would be asked 10 years ago or 20 years ago, you would ask for people that have coal in their underground. I mean, gas is going to be at the same spot of coal in 10 years. So it's better that people understand this.
Look,
because this is the way it's going to be. I mean, it's inevitable. It's just a question of time, which part of the world will hit this situation earlier than others. But it's going to happen again and again. It happened to coal, it will happen to oil, it will happen to gas.
but a fundamental point, to get to net zero or to 1.5 degree, energy has to be decarbonized. There is no other math to it. So we can think about, debate. There is no way to get to that. So the question is, how do we get there? Yeah. Some countries, as you heard, have natural endowment for renewables, right? Some countries don't. So we have to find middle ground for those countries. I think there are very few of them. But they also have to ultimately get out of it. So the question is whether they're going to invest in natural gas now or do something else. And I must say, there are few countries it's more difficult. I think all of us should figure out and help them what their transition plan would be. And they're a handful. They're not that many countries.
Yeah, and just to add in, you know, it's driving investment into new new technology. That's what's required. I agree. We are in that process of transition, and there are going to be challenges along the way. And it's thinking about the end point and the end goal. Where do we want to be, and what are we going to invest in terms of our energy crisis going forward? That's we don't have all the answers, I think, but at least we know what the challenges are, and we need to start working on them now.
Mm-hmm. Technology is in fact something I really wanted to touch on, particularly thinking about tracking emissions and being able to understand where emissions are coming from, just understanding more about that part of the world around us. So Catherine, I wondered if you had thoughts about how the technology has changed, what more we know about emissions locally, globally, and how you see that.
Yes. Well, let me just add one more thing to the previous discussion, though, and that is this, that many low-income countries do not have substantial fossil fuel resources. And so when you talk about developing, it's not a case of them using the resources they have, as Western Europe did, as North America did, as China is doing today. It is a case of them becoming indebted to the richer countries for their fuel. And so it actually enhances the inequities that we were talking about if those countries develop using fossil fuels. So getting back to the question of emissions. Up until recently, the only way that we had of telling what a country's emissions were by self-reporting. And self-reporting is a bottom-up calculation that is difficult to do and to verify. Well, no longer. Today we have satellites. And the satellites can measure the emissions. They can measure the carbon emissions, and they can measure the methane emissions. And of course, methane is a very powerful heat-trapping gas that over the short term is much more powerful than carbon dioxide. And so thanks to those measurements, like the Carbon Trace project, we now know that some countries' estimates are accurate, whereas others are not quite. And we also know, and have known for some time, that there is a lot of methane leaking out of natural gas and oil fields. Where I live in West Texas, there's enough natural gas and methane that leaks to supply 7,000 households. And so we know that there's many low-hanging fruit, so to speak, that we could address, especially with such a powerful heat-trapping gas to cap those wells, to prevent the leaks, to really crack down on things that could be done short-term today to make a huge difference. And observing is the first step, because if we don't know, it's like if the tree falls in the forest and nobody observes it. If the methane leaks and nobody observes it, how do we know where it's coming from? But now, thanks to our eyes in the sky, we do know.
How do you expect, I just want to stay on that for a moment, how do you expect that new wealth of data to be used in the transition that we're talking about right now? It all used to be self-reported. Now that data is available and ground-truthed. How do you see that influencing some of the policy necessities that we've been talking about here?
Yeah. I think that data is quite possibly the most powerful tool that we can bring to this agenda. Imagine Google Earth that's available to everyone for free, that will indicate in real time the emissions from an oil field, from a factory, from a ship, even from an airplane that's transiting over the oceans. That's what, I think it's Climate Trace or Carbon Trace?
Oh, Carbon Trace.
Carbon
right.
Trace,
Yes.
the coalition of nonprofit organizations are creating. And this opportunity to eliminate methane emissions and to do so rapidly is a very hopeful sign. And I think the availability of the information is going to bring great world pressure on people that are performing well and bad actors that are not meeting their self-determined goals.
Yeah, if I could just follow on the back of that, in terms of the data, my sense is that the input data is there, the quality of that data is right there, but there's also a lot of missing data, because a lot of people are asking or wondering, through this process, we know what we need to do, and we know we need to transition in a manner that's just and fair and equitable, right? But the data that's not out there and the metrics that's not out there and the measurements are not out there is what does that look like? How do you measure justice in terms of transition? If you're investing in technology to transition in a fair and equitable way, what are the outcomes going to look like? What does that impact look like? How can you track the difference it's made to people in society over the short and the medium and the long term? So in terms of data, the hard science data is there, but the quality of qualitative data and that social impact and the climate justice indicators, people are not looking at that. There's no research going into that. And personally, I find that quite not just interesting, but worrying, because it's half of the conversation that's kind of like missing, and I think it needs to be filled.
Do you feel that now that's part of the conversation, even if you're not seeing it reflected in research yet, that there is momentum toward that, to completing that part of the equation?
Indeed, I see what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is this drive for just transition from all kinds of stakeholders, government, industry, and so on. But what I'm not seeing is enough investment into thinking through how they're going to do it. It seems like we're in a rush to get it done. You know, the targets have been set. And what worries me is perhaps this labeling that might go on. It could be through, you know, corporate social responsibility or some other framework, so that sectors can label themselves to say we're following a transition process that's just. But when you look into it, I want to see what those metrics look like and how it really stacks up. And I'm not seeing that. Yeah. I'm just not seeing it.
Is there a set of metrics that you're happy about?
Well, in terms of the justice and the inequality, I mean, there are fundamental principles out there that we, you know, that they're values-based approaches that justice hangs on, and we need to be looking deep into that.
Yeah.
Maybe can I add one thing here, that as this transition is repetitive in its pattern, in its behavior, so it takes place industry segment by industry segment in more or less an established pattern, whereby the transformation implies massive write-offs of obsolete assets and reconversion of professional skills by masses of workers in different ways, but in more or less the same repetitive pattern. And this is combined also with the fact that geographically it is not even across the world. So it's moving around, not in sync. So that helps, because you can study these patterns in the first cases and develop metrics that can be used to track if this transition happens in a regular fashion, orderly fashion, or in a turbulent manner. So the beauty of this is that it is it's a tune that gets repeated with different tones by different instruments, but it's the same tune over and over. So once you get it a couple of times, I think it won't be difficult to track if this happens more or less justly. And of course, it is a tool that governments can use and industry segments can use to learn from each other. I mean, the energy sector to which I belong went through this basically almost there. But it's a decade that has just gone by, in which we have deposited a certain know-how on what this transition implies, on the balance sheets, on the people, and on the logics and the strategies around that. Now, the automotive sector is going through it more or less in the same fashion, only a little bit shorter time, and so forth. So I think this is helpful, because it brings about experience, and you know, we progress if we deposit experience and use it.
This is this part of the conversation is fascinating. So if you permit me, I'll make a nerdy comment.
For this audience, I'm not sure.
This is what we do, because I do, it has been very well said about transition. You're absolutely right, the social dimensional data. But I think we're conflating two things. The real revolution that you heard from John and you is what has taken place in geospatial data. And the sophistication that has happened to that, it's just, you couldn't have imagined even just a few years back. We just launched a platform 3 days back, it's a blur right now, but which will be able to measure every piece of land at 10 square meter. We will be able to see in a year every tree that's growing. If it's not growing, what crop is it? Is it soybean? Is it changed? Is it marshland? You couldn't have done that. So we would know 30% of world's carbon is stored in natural products. Is it growing? Is it not growing? What will the carbon market look like? So we can't question the fact that a revolution is happening on that'll help us. But data is just a start. Data is nothing if you're not allowing people to use it to make better decisions. It is data itself doesn't do anything. That's what all of us, I think, work to how to convert that data to decision-making tools.
And there can also be inequity in analysis, right?
Absolutely.
Even if data is accessible, if it can't be used and accessed, that can be a problem.
Well, let me actually speak to my own field of research. So I study climate adaptation, and that's the other side of the coin. Because as we know, we have 3 choices: mitigation, adaptation, or suffering. And so climate change is already here today, and we're already preparing for the impacts that it's too late to avoid. But when you look at the number of long-term weather stations in the continent of Africa for which I can develop high-resolution climate projections that can then be fed into water planning, infrastructure planning, crop management planning, you have literally the same number of long-term weather stations as you have in one large-size US state, in an entire continent. When you look at the literature, and there was a study done just recently that you might have heard, looking at climate impact studies around the world, the vast majority of those studies looking at how climate change affects crops, water, energy, infrastructure systems, they're done in the global north, not the global south. So we have a wealth of information about how climate change will affect the global north, but not the south, which is the place where climate impacts are hitting the hardest. So there is still an inequity, like you just said, in analysis, and there's even an inequity in data. Satellites are closing the gap, but we're not there yet.
Well said. I would really like the audience to have an opportunity to ask this amazing panel some questions. And I think first we might take one from our digital audience, which is expansive. So Sophie, if you got one question from our digital audience.
Yeah, that works. Okay, wow. Well, you spoke a lot about data and data analysis and its importance in climate action. And in parallel, you spoke about positive movements in the financial sector towards greater investment and caring about ESG. But one of the things that we're seeing a lot is the ways that people are reporting and what they're doing on their disclosures, how they're being analysed, that's not standardised. And that is leading to some degree of greenwashing in the financial sector. How do you combat that? How do you make sure that data is being analysed in a fair way and not just by the big players and those who are most able to analyse it in their own interests?
It's a great question.
So I'll step up to it. I think that transparency and access are the 2 ingredients that will make a data system be trustworthy and useful and complete in its coverage of the world. Exactly. This carbon trace development, which was just announced a month ago, I think is a really important initiative for which industry, ship makers, airplane operators are voluntarily submitting their data. I think that'll be the norm. That'll be what the planet expects. And I think the New York Times will help us get there.
I appreciate. I would love to then open it up to the audience. So we've got a microphone here. Let's take the first hand that I saw was the man who just took his mask off. So please.
Hi.
Just state your name, please.
I'm Aaron Cohen. Can you hear me?
No.
Hi, I'm Aaron Cohen. I'm the chairman of a climate tech company called Thermo, which is a clean cooling company. But maybe more importantly for this conversation, I also teach the history of internet media. at NYU, which I've been doing for 12 years. And John, this question goes to you, but I'm actually interested in hearing the whole panel on this as well. John, as you know, I mean, you are a seminal figure in digital media history, and you're also a pretty significant figure in the first green tech revolution and now the climate tech revolution. And I feel like we have to talk about how much wealth has been unlocked by the digital revolution, the trillions and trillions of dollars of wealth. And a comment like Larry Fink made this week, which is, you know, the next 1,000 unicorns will be climate tech companies. Few people have an ability to kind of think about that juxtaposition more than you. And I wonder if you could talk about that and why you are, as you started, hopeful but not necessarily optimistic, because that's not the John Doerr that I grew up with in the digital revolution.
Well, let me give you some encouragement. I do believe that transitioning justly to the new clean energy economy is the greatest investment and moral opportunity of our lifetime. I think, if I can go to an extreme, that this climate transition has been underhyped. And I said that about the internet in the early days, that it had been underhyped. And by that I mean it's underestimated and it's underappreciated. It's the most important thing that we can be doing, that I can be doing with my good luck in my life and my remaining time here. And this doesn't turn on me. This turns on thousands and thousands of risk takers and entrepreneurs in the policy sector, in the social sector, in the technology sector, and most of all, our political leaders. Of all the sectors of the economy that are working on this problem, our policymakers are moving the slowest. That's where we need to make sure that we develop broad voter pressure for leaders who will make climate their top priority. Let me just close with one other datum for you. Pick just one market, the market for electric vehicle batteries. The estimates are that is $400 billion per year for 20 years to electrify the world's transportation fleet. I want to tell you that everything that Facebook and Google are fighting over, online ads in the US, is only $80 billion a year. Electric batteries is 5 times bigger than that, and that's a small part of the new clean energy economic revolution that we need to lead and deliver for the world. The clean energy economy has been underhyped.
One more question in the back. It's a little hard to tell, but yep, you got it.
Thanks for an interesting panel. My name's Luke. I'm here with the Youth Constituency and from Australia. I was wanting to pick up on a point made earlier about the first loss capital needed, and particularly the role of the World Bank and the IMF. And I'm wondering where, from your perspective, we're at in terms of the World Bank and the IMF plausibly taking on that role in the near future, and what the barriers might be to that.
So the barriers, if you want me to handle that, the barriers will be in the charter organizations of the IMF and the World Bank, their funders amending their charter. But there were important and meaningful conversations and collaboration towards getting that done at this very COP.
Honey?
So I used to work at the World Bank for a long time. John, maybe you're right about the charter. I actually think they can do a lot without changing the charter.
Really?
Yes. At this point, the World Bank and all these banks together spend about $300, maybe a little less than $300 billion a year. As we heard, there's a gap of $1.5 trillion from where we are, where we need to go. That has to come from private capital. So what this $300 billion can do is de-risk this capital, make that move faster. That is what needs to happen. And if this doesn't happen fast enough, I think actually the private capital is going to go and make this international multilateral banks irrelevant. I hope that doesn't happen. The indications are they're stepping up. IMF is doing a bit. And the indications are that these banks will play that role of de-risking this capital, because this 300 billion itself is not enough to do what we need to do. But it can be a very important catalytic capital to make the other capital flow. I mean, Larry Fink wrote in your paper, wrote an op-ed exactly saying that. So I do think there's a possibility. John, it is important for them to change their charter for other reasons, but I think they can do what we're talking about
without a charter
without changing their charter. Because I don't think there's a question now between development versus climate change. If that was the case, they would have to. They were set up for development.
The great opportunity here is to unlock the direct and indirect subsidies for the petroleum industry and the agricultural industry to get on board with, this is your field, climate-friendly agendas.
If I can add, I would subscribe to what Annie said, and we work with the World Bank and the IFC in many parts of the world. And increasingly, their perception is that the role is the one of the icebreaker, or if you want, the risker of reference, so that then private capital can come in with a reduced or normalized perception of risk. And I think the time that it did that, it worked. It worked extremely well in Africa. It worked extremely well in other parts of the world. So I think, yes, the charter is important, but it's, I think their view of the role, that is not just the role of a subscriber of a loan, it's a different role. It's one of an enabler of a different risk profile. I think that's really their future, because, again, I subscribe to what Annie said. If they don't do that, somebody else will step in and do it, and I think then at this point they will be marginalized. But the indications are that they are active in that.
And as you heard from John, it's such a $400 billion market of batteries. Private sector is not going to sit around, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They're just going to go and do it.
Yeah.
That's a good note to end on, right? No one's just going to sit around. And an optimistic note at that. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you, panelists. Thank you.